Good afternoon and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's session of Columbia Energy Straight Talk. My name is David Hill. I'm an adjunct senior research scholar at Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy. Let me quickly say that this event is being webcast live and the full video will be available in the coming days. Today we're going to be discussing environmental regulation of the energy sector. That's a big topic and obviously is far more complex and far broader than we can fully cover in 90 minutes. But we have a great guest with us today, and we're going to talk about some of the most important and pressing topics out there. As a reminder, for those of you joining us via Zoom, you can submit a question at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I'm sure we'll get to more questions than we can, or that we'll get more questions than we can answer in the 90 minutes that we have. But please submit them and we'll get to them, get to as many of them as possible. Just a hint and a suggestion for you. The briefer and more to the point that your question is, the more likely it is that Cheryl and I will actually be able to read it and the possibility that we'll be able to ask it. So do whatever you think is best, but that will enable us to get more questions in if you make your questions as brief and to the point as possible. With that, let me hand it over to my Columbia colleague and good friend and Straight Talk Energy co-host, Cheryl LaFleur.
Hey, David. Thank you, David. Today's topic could not be more timely. As everyone knows, last week, President Biden announced a goal of reducing economy-wide greenhouse gases in the U.S. by at least 50% by 2030, although not yet reflected in any legally binding standards. It's a national aspiration. 24 states and the District of Columbia have also set greenhouse gas targets. A number of approaches are being debated to reach these targets, including cap and trade, renewable and clean energy standards, carbon pricing, direct selection of resources, and others. Our guest today is one of the nation's leading experts on effective programs to reduce greenhouse gases. Mary Nichols was the chair of the California Air Resources Board, CARB, from 1979 to 1982 and from 2007 to 2019, and was a member of the board from 1975 to 1979, where she spearheaded and implemented California's successful cap and trade program for GHGs. She's also served as the assistant administrator of the US EPA for air and radiation, where she implemented cap and trade for sulfur dioxide and acid rain. She was the Secretary of Natural Resources for the state of California and a leader at the NRDC and UCLA. For all these accomplishments, she's been dubbed the Queen of Green. Now, the capstone of her career is that she has now been made a Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy. Major upgrade from the last one. So we're really happy to have you here. Welcome, Mary. I know that there's a lot of things we hope to discuss today. I want to start with your work at CARB. You instituted and led a cap and trade program that covered electricity, natural gas supplies, and transportation fuel. And you did it under three different big personality governors from three different parties. I'm interested in what were your biggest challenges, political or otherwise, in getting that launched and carrying it out, and how you overcame them, hoping that things we can learn from on the national level or in other states.
And how many hours have we got for this?
Just your biggest challenges. We don't have enough for all of them.
Well, first of all, I would say that my original boss and the instigator of the cap and trade program in California was Arnold Schwarzenegger, who signed the original climate legislation in California that set up the program. So that was when we actually had a target as a state and had to develop a plan. And he made it clear from day one that he wanted to have a cap and trade program. He was very impressed by the EU, the environmental trading system. He wanted to do something like that for California, maybe even have California joined in that system. Unfortunately, while this was his idea, the Democratic majority in the legislature didn't like this idea much at all. They were basically suspicious of any kind of a cap and trade program, and they were suspicious of Arnold. So this did not make matters easy. And what we ended up doing, which was sort of a compromise, was reflected in a single chart that I actually prepared, which showed that we were going to do a cap and trade program, which I'll talk about why we decided that was the right thing to do, aside from the fact that it was what the governor wanted us to do. But it showed that the program was going to cover 85% of the emissions in California. They would be under the cap. Whatever the cap was, it would apply to them. But at the same time, we would only use that program to try to reduce something like 18% of the emissions that we were going to need to reduce in order to meet our target under the legislation. So we could legitimately say it's a big program, but we could also say, but it's really only a small program because it only covers this small amount of the reductions that we're trying to get. And it's a true fact. And it was how it worked because we used our cap mainly as a disciplinary device. It obviously was a huge issue and was talked about a lot in some circles. But at the same time, the average person in California to this day probably doesn't know that there is a cap and trade program and hasn't really in any obvious way ever been affected by it, whereas they all know about our commitments to renewable electricity and our vehicle tailpipe standards, all of the other parts of the portfolio that actually were doing most of the work of reducing emissions.
So, Mary, there are lots of follow-ups out of what you just said there, but can I ask a couple? One is that you noted that when this was going on in California, that Governor Schwarzenegger was for it, that a lot of the Democrats in the legislature were against it. Right. At the federal level, we've seen things where a lot of the Republicans have been against various cap and trade legislation at various times. So it almost seems like you successfully implemented a program where 100% of the people might be against it, and so what's remarkable is that you did that successfully. And then we can even go back to your tenure at the at EPA in the 90s when you were implementing the acid rain trading program, which is, I think a lot of people would say one of, if not the most successful pollution control programs in history anywhere. How do you sort of think about that? The fact that you successfully implemented two different trading programs, two different market-oriented programs, that in both situations, a lot of people hated it. And so I don't know. How did you successfully do that? And what do you attribute your success to?
I think you have to have a thick skin in this situation, right? The fact that I was not an elected official and wasn't worrying about having to stand for election undoubtedly was a help. And I would say at any given time, any of my bosses would have been happy to throw me under the bus, if things hadn't worked out well. So it does take a certain amount of cold-bloodedness, I guess, to follow through on one of these kinds of programs. And you have to have really good people technically who know what they're doing, who can carry out the details of the program, including the kind of proactive protections against market manipulation that are the main thing that would cause a program like that to crater if it became a scandal, if there was a scandal of hoarding of allowances or, backroom trading or any of the things that made people very suspicious at the time we were starting this cap and trade program about Wall Street in general, and markets and, all the divisiveness about who gets to participate, who gets hurt, et cetera. So I don't want to try to, minimize the difficulty of doing what we did, but I do think that this is one of a kind of classic cases where what the experts believe is correct and have good evidence, economists can show why it is that a cap and trade program is likely to be the most efficient way to reduce a certain number of emissions. It will get you the reductions that you know about at the least cost. What's wrong with it? Well, what's wrong with it is that people in general are not economists and they don't like hearing about how you're going to get emission reductions through some scheme where big companies are going to be trading something back and forth, and they just don't believe that that's actually going to work. So I guess there's two ways to solve it. You could try to convince people that they're wrong and that this is really a program that they should love. And you can go over this until you're blue in the face as to why it's a good idea. Or you can maybe talk to people who are open to being persuaded, but mostly you can try to implement it in a way that people see that they get benefits from it and don't see any problems. And that was the approach that we took, was to try to design a program where there would not be any scandals, there wouldn't be any failures in the market itself, and we would be able to show that we were actually getting the reduction. So the system that we devised is very information heavy. It requires a lot of reporting. Reporting has to be on an annual basis. It has to be, the reports have to be verified by independent third-party verifiers who are certified by the state. Very little room for people to use offsets. So it was only allowances that the state itself issued. We had a numbered certificate for every allowance, so you could track where every single one of them went. We built a system with a lot of extra belts and suspenders on it just for that reason. And I think it was important that we do it in order to be allowed to go forward with the program when we first started it, because as I started to say before, we designed this program under Arnold Schwarzenegger, but we flipped the switch under Governor Brown. And when he came in, he had expressed very open skepticism about this program. So he had to be persuaded to let it go forward, and he did. But in a typical way that governors do, he didn't come out and issue a press release that said, today we're starting California's first auction. He had nothing to do with it. It was us at ARB who got to actually start the program. And we didn't try to make a big PR success out of it either. We didn't really start talking much in a big public way about this cap and trade program, other than to insiders who actually were following the issue, until we had some success at the first auction. And then suddenly there was revenue, and then people were interested.
Mary, first of all, we had a question in the chat that I mistakenly said I'd answer live, which I thought was a thing you clicked on in order to answer in the chat. And it was like, which 3 governors did you work with? So you've mentioned
Schwarzenegger, Brown twice, but before that, Gray Davis, who actually set up he deserves credit. So you could say 4, because he started the original program to gather emissions data and build the first reporting system for California. But the 3rd governor would be Gavin Newsom, who I worked for the past 2 years. And I just stepped down from my role at CARB after he had completed 2 years. And so that's why I'm here.
Thank you. Well, following up on that, was it a matter of like you launched it and didn't tick too many people off in that process, and you said life went on as before, and then it kind of went along? I'm sure you had many challenges to deal with as you went forward, or did you have to kind of fight for your political survival again and again? Was it something that had to be reauthorized in some way? There's something we see, of course, in Congress, that things are only, like the renewable tax credits. Every 3 years, you have the same fight again and again. How was that set up?
Well, there were a couple of moments of truth. It is important to say, though, that the California legislature, when they passed AB 32, which was our initial climate act that said we're going to have a target for emissions reductions and we're going to achieve it, told the Air Resources Board, the agency that I had the honor of chairing, you go develop the plan, and did not require any particular action to do that. It was just, you go develop the plan. And we did not believe, and nobody else believed at that point, that we actually needed new legislation to create the cap and trade program. We had the regulatory authority handed to us to devise and to implement the program. However, that didn't mean that it went without any bumps. There was an election in California. We have the initiative process, and several companies, we referred to them as the Texas oil companies, and it was Texas oil companies that led this campaign, qualified an initiative for the ballot with enough signatures, which it's not hard to do, to stop the program until a particular trigger was met. A particular finding would have to be made that unemployment in California had fallen below 5%. And this was on the ballot in a year when we were in the midst of our terrible national recession. They started this in 2008-9, but it was on the ballot at the same time that there was a gubernatorial election. So Jerry Brown had to be on the ballot along with this initiative measure. And it was the largest environmental initiative campaign that had ever happened in California up until that time. We've had plenty of ballot measures for environmental causes. This was obviously seen as being an anti-environmental initiative. And the No campaign, the campaign that supported our program, raised more money than had ever been raised on any environmental ballot initiative before that time. And we won by a larger number of votes than anybody in that election, including Governor Brown, who was running at the same time. So this was an amazing campaign, and it was led by, among others, a bipartisan coalition that included Tom Steyer, well-known Democratic investor and climate activist, and George Shultz, the late George Shultz, I'm sorry to say, but a very well-known and prominent Republican from the Hoover Institute at Stanford. The two of them teamed up to defend the cap and trade program, but the campaign never mentioned the words cap and trade. The campaign was all about electricity prices, and it was about electricity sources. So the people who wanted the initiative passed had ads that they ran that showed, ordinary housewife, quote unquote, opening the bill, shock and horror, discussion about how this was all was happening because of the government's program. The No campaign was pretty much all about either the Texas oil companies trying to tell us how we could get our electricity, or very positive commercials that showed diverse young people in all parts of the state of California out there, hammering on new solar roofs. So, it was all about energy and not at all about cap and trade.
Mary, you mentioned a minute ago about how the cap and trade program that was put in place in California was, and I think you used the figure 18%. 18% of the emissions reductions were going to come from that program. And so 82% of the projected emissions reductions were going to be coming from other various mandates or programs of various kinds or requirements. What do you think about that? I mean, the fact that a cap and trade or trading system, if it's going to happen, is going to be put on top of everything else, instead of saying, well, look, I mean, the whole point is to kind of get rid of some of this other complexity and some of these other mandates. And how did you think about that, or what do you think about that overall? And is it just basically, well, look, regardless of what I think about it, it's a matter of political economy. This is how it's actually going to happen. So who cares about efficiency? Or is it a matter of, look, there's a desirable way to do this, and this is how we have to do it? I don't know. Can you just talk about that a little bit?
Well, sure. This is something that I sometimes feel like it's counterintuitive, but businesses who advocated for the cap and trade program definitely hoped that it would get rid of some of our specific mandates. And the oil and gas industry in particular argued vociferously that given that we had this cap and trade program, which they acquiesced in, they supported the creation of the program. If we were going to have a climate law, that was how they wanted to have it actually achieve the results. But we also adopted something called the low carbon fuel standard, which directly applies to anybody who markets transportation fuel in the state of California, and requires them to reduce the carbon content of the fuels that they sell over a period of time by a percentage, and allows for people who want to qualify lower carbon fuel. There's a sort of a base fuel that's the California basket of fuels, and then there's the ability to qualify other fuels for credits, which can then be bought and sold in a separate marketplace. Long story short, it's a wonderful program, and I hope it is going to become part of the federal climate program, because I think it's much better. It's been shown to be much more useful than the model of the RFS, which is now pretty much, I think, on the rocks. But having said all of that, we argued, and I think with respect to electricity, this is, maybe more obvious, that the cap and the system that we use that required the utilities to put their allowances, which were distributed, without charge initially. They were required to put them up for auction and then use the proceeds of the auction in part to help keep customers' bills down with this program. So you have the cap that applies the discipline that shows you're meeting your goals, and you have the trading system that helps keep the prices down. And the utilities have a choice then at that point. Do they want to be buyers? Do they want to invest in, going faster in the direction of meeting their separate mandated renewable electricity requirements? But it's a way of actually, I believe, and I think this is what others have found, helps to provide flexibility for the companies that are subject to the program, helps keep the prices down. So you're pricing carbon, but you're not looking to it. You're not looking to that price as the major signal of what you have to do. You also have the regulatory program that says to these same companies, you're going to have to go out and acquire more zero carbon electricity. So you sort of need all of these programs to work together. There isn't one single tool that's going to do it all.
Well, we're having a lot of those same debates right now, as you know, about monetizing carbon at the national level and at the regional level in the various regional markets. Most market operators and economists would like to monetize carbon as the best way to bring down greenhouse gases and still keep some of the benefits of resource neutral market selection of resources. And as you noted, happened in California recently. People like the American Petroleum Institute and some of the oil and gas companies have also called for carbon pricing, which seems to not be doing it any good in the court of public opinion. But many others are very opposed to that as a strategy, either on the grounds that it'll hurt environmental justice because it'll make things be cited in certain ways, or will take away control of where things are cited. And I mean, do you have a view on that tension, between sort of state or local control over where things are and allowing a market structure that forces the most efficient reductions?
Yeah, so I'm going to give you a typical sort of political person's answer, but I do feel that there needs to be some of both. I think that the current emphasis on environmental justice is entirely appropriate and needs to be built into, in some fashion or another, whatever the accountability system is for your climate program, it has to include accountability for the impacts on the most impacted communities. That should be a part of the design of the program. At the same time, I don't think it gives you an instant answer as to whether you can do a carbon pricing program or not. Just as with our tax system, the fact that you're collecting revenue from whatever activity it is doesn't mean that the people who are paying it are going to get all the benefits. In fact, the opposite should be the case, right? You use the system as a way to acquire resources to do good things. The California cap and trade system survived another potential near-death experience under Jerry Brown in his last year in office, when we had another one of our famous initiative campaigns. This one put on the ballot by conservatives, but passed with the big majority, that said that anytime the government does anything that increases fees or creates a new tax or raises a tax, that it takes a 2/3 vote of the legislature to do, which even with the lopsided Democratic majorities that we have in these recent years in California, is still a very hard thing to do. Governor Brown went to the legislature and got them to authorize the cap and trade program with a 2/3 vote in order to give it a life. So we would not have to go back and get new legislation whenever the price of the allowances went up, which we knew it would do. It would have to, as you lowered the cap. So why the big turnaround? Well, for one thing, he became persuaded that it was a workable and useful program. But the biggest seller was that this program was raising billions of dollars, which the legislature and the governor together could spend on things that benefit some of our most disadvantaged communities. And the legislature itself had previously passed a bill that said that 40%, this is a number that you've heard again in the Biden proposal, 40% was to be spent for the benefit of the lowest income communities, 25% of it on programs actually in those communities, and the rest in programs that we could demonstrate, were for the benefit of those communities. And so from the moment that the program actually started operation till now, it has generated funds for a variety of existing and some new programs that most people don't realize have anything to do with cap and trade, of course, because they're not generally talked about that way, but which have been used to reduce air pollution emissions, improve water quality, help with urban transit, help with urban communities getting connected to broadband, just a whole range of things that most people would say are good programs, but that are programs that probably wouldn't have been able to pass without that new revenue. And the fact that they are helping with the most impacted communities, those who have seen the most environmental injustices, I think is the best demonstration that you could ask for, that you can do a pricing program in a way that in fact promotes rather than hurting environmental justice.
Well, you're certainly right that that did not get a lot of publicity, at least in the national press. We have a wide range of questions ranging from very details on the program to very general, but there's one I just want to take up before we go any further. Is somebody asked for a simple definition of what cap and trade is, which we kind of jumped over, because we want to make this a program for the general audience, not just for the same 50 energy geeks that David and I talk to all day. So I'd like you to answer that, and then I'll turn to David for the next question.
Well, I'm not sure that this is a perfectly correct answer, but as we understood it, what it meant was that the state would create a program whereby companies or entities that were subject to that program, so anybody who was under the cap, which in California was about initially 700 different entities, it ended up having to have allowances, which the state would issue, that covered whatever their greenhouse gas emissions were. So to try to make it even more simplistic, if you have a refinery and you're emitting 200 tons of CO2, you have to have allowances for 200 tons. If you don't, you're subject to major penalties and fines. But in order to get those 200 allowances, you have a choice of either reducing your own emissions, which are now too high as the cap goes down. You have to either clean up your own operations and prove that you're now emitting less, or you have to purchase allowances from some other company that's under this program through a trading system. So it provides the flexibility for the regulated industry to either clean up their own plant or to buy allowances that clean up somebody else's operation. And there's a lot of different bells and whistles that can go along with it. But I think that is the basic description of how the program is designed to work. And that's it.
So if there's something you want less of, you say, we're only going to allow this much in the whole state, and then next year it'll be a little less, and the next year a little less. And you either have to make less of that or find someone else making less of that and
I used to describe it as
the
musical chairs.
lower it goes, the more it'll cost to find someone who can sell you something, which is
Right.
kind of how it's supposed to work. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Mary, we've gotten a fair number of questions in the chat about a couple of different subjects, and these are, so I'll just ask them in one question, but it's kind of two different things. One is nuclear. I mean, California has worked to close down some of the nuclear facilities that obviously otherwise produce massive amounts of carbon-free electricity. And what do you think about that? And then number two is with respect to offsets. The offsets obviously play an important role in the program that you administered in California, but there's a lot of controversy about some of the offsets, and would like you to address in particular kind of the whole concept of forestry offsets. We've gotten several questions related to that.
And maybe explain where they are, or what they are for the people who didn't ask this question.
Well, I'll do the nuclear question first, if you would like, because California has had on the books for many years now a policy of opposing construction of new plants in California unless and until the problem of what to do with the radioactive waste is solved. And so to this day, it's illegal to construct a new nuclear plant in California because there has not been a certification that there's a place to take the waste to. The state as a whole has, our utilities buy electricity from nuclear plants, both within the state and outside of the state. The most well-known one being in Arizona, where LAUDWP is a minor owner, but there's they are generating nuclear energy. But before that, we had two big plants, San Onofre and Diablo Canyon, which have their own issues and concerns. But the state didn't push to shut those plants down. They were both San Onofre had its own disaster or near disaster with some reactors that forced partial shutdown, and the owner decided to shut the whole thing down. Diablo Canyon was reaching the point where it needed relicensing, and the owners, San Onofre was Southern California Edison, Diablo Canyon is PG&E. They worked with the local community as well as the regulatory agencies on a shutdown plan. But the utility itself made the decision that they wanted to shut that plant down. In both cases, the utilities are being pushed very strongly in the direction of renewable electricity, and nuclear does not count as renewable electricity under our definition, or it's zero carbon electricity, obviously, but it's not renewable. And so we are at a point now where the amount of electricity coming from nuclear is dwindling fast. But I don't think it's true to say that it would never be considered as an alternative going forward. I think, there's a lot happening on the technology side there. It just looks like it's not the most promising avenue to pursue, given that we have so much opportunity for solar and wind, offshore wind, et cetera. So that's the nuclear story as best I can describe it. As far as offsets are concerned, offsets are, it's a sort of a loaded word. And I think from the very beginning of the Kyoto Treaty, the use of offsets has generated a lot of controversy and issues about whether the offsets were real and permanent, whether they were excessive, whether they were going to last over time, whether they'd be enforceable. And it's a term, again, probably we should define it, but let's say in our cap and trade program, for example, if you weren't creating your own reductions by cleaning up your operation, and you couldn't find, or you thought that the allowances that your neighbor was offering for sale were too expensive, there could be a third option, which is you could go to another private market and get offsets, which would be tons that would have been registered by, let's say, an operator of a forest who was promising to save old growth trees for 100 years and not let them be cut down. That would then create an offset for the carbon that wasn't being emitted that otherwise legally could have been emitted or would have been emitted, and therefore you could buy an offset that way. And there's been a huge amount of interest over the years in ways that you could generate offsets doing things that otherwise the government couldn't or politically wouldn't regulate. So it couldn't be required. It wouldn't happen otherwise. That's sort of the test, is a kind of a but-for test. And that you could verify that they were real. And if they weren't real, that you could, have some legal action, some legal recourse to both validate the offset and make whoever it was who had purchased it do something else. So when we created our cap and trade program in California, we didn't say no offsets, but we said a very small amount of offsets would be allowed in the system, up to 8% in any compliance period of the required allowances could come from offsets. And then we required that those offsets would have to be from within the United States. So no Brazilian rainforests offsets were going to be allowed in the program. And they would have to be offsets that would be registered with an approved registry, and they would have to be subject to a protocol, an accounting protocol that that ARB would approve. So very rigid requirements. The people who generate offsets or who wanted to generate offsets were not happy with this program at all, because it didn't look like it was going to be a big opportunity for their business to grow. And the companies that thought they might want offsets, of whom one of the leaders was our own, local, our own state-based oil company, Chevron, was a big proponent of wanting to use offsets. They were very unhappy with how limited our use of offsets was. But that was the way we started the program. It was controversial from the very beginning, and it's still controversial.
Oh, thank you. And I know you have a lot more to say on that topic than is even than we even have time for here now. But that is a really interesting topic overall, just about obviously program implementation and cost and everything else. Can I turn to the Clean Air Act? So this there are lots of questions to ask about the Clean Air Act, but I'll just sort of tee up one for you, and then you can go with it wherever you want. Obviously, in the Massachusetts versus EPA case back in 2007, why the Supreme Court said that that the term air pollutant under the Clean Air Act, it included greenhouse gases. I mean, it authorized the regulation of greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. That led to various efforts, the Clean Power Plan and so forth. And then in 2014, the Supreme Court actually, in a different case, the UARG against EPA case, said, well, air pollutant, it can mean some things under one part of the act and mean other things under other parts of the act. And there was, of course, the tailoring rule where the EPA did the tailoring rule to try to make certain parts of the act work for greenhouse gases and so forth. They're obviously regulating greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act presents lots of very difficult challenges, in both practical, legal, administrative. What do you think what is the right path at this point? I mean, I'm interested both in what you think about the Clean Power Plan, as well as what do you really think that EPA ought to be doing at this point? I mean, should it be doing a different Clean Power Plan? Should it be doing something else? Should it say, look, I mean, there are lots of things about the Clean Air Act that don't really work for greenhouse gases. Yes, I mean, the Supreme Court decided what it did in Mass v. EPA, but Congress needs to do something. I mean, what should EPA be doing at this point?
Well, David, as you know, I am a Clean Air Act lawyer. I started my life as a lawyer at the very moment that the Clean Air Act was coming into effect. And I've been a believer in it and seen it as being a very capacious and very useful statute for many years now. And I have followed how it has been interpreted. And of course, it's only been amended twice. There's a tendency with all the problems and all the difficulties to somehow find that, well, opening it up is riskier than living with it the way it is. And having had the opportunity to be the air administrator right after it had just been reauthorized under George Bush, and to implement the acid rain trading program, as you all pointed out earlier, as well as some of the other more complicated, or not necessarily complicated, but more painful and difficult parts of the act, like, for example, the mandatory inspection and maintenance program for motor vehicles. That was way more difficult than anything involving acid rain. A part of me wants to say, I've created an awful lot of work for lawyers over the years, and that's not a bad thing, since I'm one of them myself. But I do feel that the fact that it's difficult and complicated to use the act this way is not a reason not to use it. In fact, it may even compel us to use it in the absence of anything else. There is plenty of evidence that if you pick out certain words in various places, that there have been people along the way, including the last time the act was reauthorized, who understood that we were talking about more than just localized exposures in communities, that pollution travels over large distances across boundaries, and that there's an international element to this problem. So I don't think it's wrong to say that the act itself, without any serious, torture, can be seen as covering the forms of pollution that are causing the global warming. Greenhouse gases fit within the structure of the Clean Air Act. Now, I do feel that the way that the administration chose to go after the power plant and the Clean Power Plan, because of their concerns about how to control pollution beyond the fence line.
And again, Mary, when you're talking about the administration, we're talking about the Obama administration.
The Obama administration, not this one or the Trump administration. That's right. Under President Obama, EPA ventured forth to do something bold and big and important, which was to deal with the emissions from the electricity sector, and to come up with a way that didn't just limit you to controlling within the boundaries of a particular plant. Because if you did that, you'd be limited to technology solutions such as some form of carbon capture, let's say from a coal-fired power plant, as opposed to looking at a way that a coal-fired plant owner could reduce emissions by converting to natural gas, let's say, which would obtain a lot more emissions reductions more cost effectively and lead you in the direction that ultimately we need to go in. So how can you come up with a rule under the Clean Air Act that goes beyond an individual permit, an individual plant, and look at the system as a whole? And EPA has been, working around those kinds of issues for a long time now, well beyond what acid rain incurred, through state implementation plans. And states could, if they wanted to, do a lot more on a sector basis, probably than can be done, on a blanket program by US EPA. But there were people who looked at this problem and thought, there's some other ways we could do this that would be less clunky, for lack of a better word, less tortured than the program that EPA ultimately came up with under the Clean Power Plan. And I was involved in an effort in the Western United States that was led by Governor Ritter. Then I guess he was already former Governor Ritter at that point of Colorado, who convened state energy and air regulators in a regional effort to talk about whether there would be some form of a regional emissions trading program that the states might want, that they would prefer, that would be less costly. And there was a fair amount of interest in that before the whole issue sort of went on ice for a while under the Trump administration. There's also another section of the Clean Air Act, which has, its own issues, as does the section that EPA used, which I think would be a preferable approach legally. And we can talk about that more, but, talk about getting into the weeds. I'm not sure that this is what most of your audience really wants to hear, but let's just say Section 115.
I do think it's worth just touching on that, though. I mean, you're talking about Section 115.
I am.
You may just want to just touch on it very briefly. So for those who are watching and who haven't looked at Section 115, some of the other sections that we've been talking about, and you're right, Mary. I mean, we probably don't want to go through 112, 109, 108, and all that stuff. But although those are all, I think those are all great topics. But you may want to mention just 115, just so for anybody watching, if they want to actually go take a closer look at that.
So Section 115 of the Clean Air Act could be called the international section of the Clean Air Act. And it provides a process by which, if the president or states ask EPA to make a finding that pollution generated within the United States is causing violations of or harm to health in other places, EPA can require states to develop a plan, like the state implementation plans that they do for all the pollutants that are listed under the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. They would have to develop a plan that shows how they would reduce their contribution to the harm in other places, but only in proportion to what the other place, the other country is required to do themselves to reduce the problem. So it could be kind of like viewed as a way of getting EPA into the business of having states do plans that will reduce our national contribution to international greenhouse gas problems. So it would be a way of implementing the requirements of Paris and moving forward, with states having a lead role in developing these plans. And I think we know that if it worked, if we started down that path, the states would immediately start looking at whether there would be regional approaches that they could take that would help make this easier and less expensive to do. And we'd be where I've always hoped we would be in this country, which is in a situation where, at least for the electricity system, you do have solutions that work with the grid, that work on the basis of how we actually market electricity. So this appears to provide the legal authority for doing that, a framework for doing it. It's not ever been invoked, so we can't say for certain exactly how it would work, but a number of legal scholars have now put together a book of essays on this topic, and there's others who've written about it, strongly suggesting that that the difficulties are not that great, and that it could be done in a pretty straightforward way.
Can I, Cheryl, I'm going to just ask Mary one follow-up. I'm sorry. Mary, if you were at EPA right now, is 115 where you would go?
Yes. Yeah.
Well,
Easy
maybe
answer.
you've answered my question. I mean, I was involved in the Clean Power Plan, primarily in working with states and state regulators to make sure there were not reliability issues, which were very seriously raised when, if I recall correctly, in the Obama era, the Clean Power Plan was going to reduce greenhouse gases on a just electricity sector 17%, 18%.
Yep.
Now President Biden is talking about 50 to 52% economy wide.
Right.
Do you think that can happen without legislation? I mean, do you think the Clean Air Act is robust enough to carry that burden, or do you think we need a new law?
Well, first of all, I am happy to say that, President Biden is looking at this from what they call a whole of government approach. So I don't think, even if there were no new legislation, that the Clean Air Act would be looked to carry the entire burden. Although I do think that EPA is sort of uniquely suited to being the accounting agency to keep track of everything that's being done. But I do think that utilizing other authorities that the government has in the transportation area, in funding that the government gets to spend, regulatory agencies like your old agency, to FERC, they have tools that they can use. And if there's a general commitment from the president and others are willing to go along with it, then I think you have the ability to have a much more holistic and robust system. And by the way, I think that would have to include Department of Agriculture. It should include, forestry and farms and food system. So, there's a lot of material there to work with, and that's exciting.
Hey, Mary, I've got to tell you that Cheryl, we of course text back and forth here with questions in the chat about, okay, well, maybe we should move to this topic or that topic. And Cheryl just said, maybe we should move to cars, EVs. And of course, I responded with, can I ask one more follow-up? So
well, this is a lot of fun for me, guys.
As long as it doesn't have a statutory section in the question.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, my follow-up was I asked if 115 was where you would go on this if you were at EPA. Can you just as a thumbnail? I mean, if you were at EPA, what else are there other particular things that would be right at the top of your priority list? Maybe they're on greenhouse gases, but not even just exclusively greenhouse gases. I mean, if there are other things, they would be right at the top of my list.
Okay, well, first of all, I am a clean air maven, and I do view climate change as the overarching environmental problem of our time. But that doesn't mean that EPA can neglect the responsibilities that it has for assuring that communities around the country are also able to access clean water, that they are protected against assaults from toxic chemicals, especially from abandoned waste facilities, or from the leftovers of some of the activities that our society used to condone, going back as far as World War II. I live in Los Angeles, and we still have groundwater basins that are unable to be used, even for storage, because they were contaminated during the Second World War. And what they were contaminated with is chemicals that were used in building airplanes and things that we needed, to fight the war. So those activities wouldn't be allowed today, or they certainly wouldn't be allowed to use those particular chemicals now. But we, as a society, are still paying the price of some of that activity. So this is all part of what EPA is required to do, and their relationships really are more at the local level, more at the community level than I think any other agency of the federal government. I mean, maybe the Army Corps of Engineers with the dams that they, have to be responsible for making safe at the local level. But this is serious stuff. So I think those things have to be looked at, and I'm not at all up to speed on everything that's happened at the EPA over the last 4 years, but from talking to friends who do work in some of these other areas, there are issues that are probably at least as bad as the ones that I was fighting against on behalf of the Air Resources Board against the past administration. But having said all of that, I would personally go after, I would start now to be looking at what the next round of vehicle emission standards are going to be, because those take a long time to put in place. And we're in a moment where the industry in the US is undergoing also huge transformation. So, we've been talking about electricity because, of course, that's the area of expertise and the topic of this program. But transportation emissions are a majority now of emissions within our country. And even though it's more diverse and diffuse and difficult to get at, we have to address that aspect if we're going to come up with the kinds of reductions that the president is talking about. You couldn't do that without touching on transportation. And that is EPA's particular area of expertise.
Well, one thing that I know that happened at EPA in the last 4 years is a lot of people left, and there was even it was all over town that Michael Picker, the president of the California PUC, was outside the EPA building with a sign saying, "California wants environmental lawyers and environmental engineers. Come to Sacramento." So possibly we'll give some of them back now to our federal government. But I did want to pivot to vehicles. Because one of the things during your term, we've talked a lot about your setting up the air pollution standards, the cap and trade, but one of the things you got a lot of notoriety for was going toe to toe with the big auto manufacturers and holding car manufacturers, jet manufacturers, and others to standards of lower emissions that are actually spreading from California elsewhere in the country. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that part of your work in California, and we'll surely use that to pivot. I think David is as skeptical of some of the electrical vehicle programs as he is of some of the specific sections of the Clean Air Act that the EPA might use. But I'm going to start with a big general question, because it's not immediately obvious that would be having to deal with General Motors, if I remember correctly, is something you would have to do your job, but that's something California did.
Right. So first of all, California's reason for being at the table when you talk about the transportation system, and what gave us, frankly, the credibility and the confidence to embark on a climate program was the fact that under the Clean Air Act, California is the only state in the country that has the ability to set emission standards for vehicles. And from that flows a whole set of other regulatory programs and initiatives that we've been involved with going back to the late 1960s. So the fact that California was allowed to set stricter standards than whatever the federal government was going to set meant that we were able, first on our own and then later joined by the federal government, because normally the California standards have been adopted, but usually with a lag time of 3 or 5 years by the federal government. And this is what has made as much progress as we have in California on clean air to the point where, today we never see anything like the levels of pollution that we did back in the 70s and 80s, or even the 90s, into the 90s, and where the vehicles themselves have now emerged at the point where an internal combustion engine car that you could buy today, any car that you could purchase, even a big SUV, is going to emit less than 1% of the regulated pollutants that it could have emitted, that it would have been allowed to emit back in the 70s. So this has been a triumph, but it's not just for California, it's also a triumph for the other states that adopted California standards when they were allowed to do it, for the country as a whole, because these cleaner cars are sold everywhere. And it's a triumph for the US industry and for other companies that now have achieved these amazing technology improvements over a period of time, when we have more cars being sold, more miles being driven, than ever before. And we didn't wreck the economy. And, our cars are, they're safe and fun to drive. So I'm kind of a car person. I like cars. Yeah, I don't think you could do this work if you didn't like cars. But I think it's important to recognize that this is a demonstration of what regulatory power can do if it's done based on consensus that there's a need out there, which is the political consensus. And if there's a technical knowledge on the part of the people who are writing the regulations, that means that they write regulations that make sense and can be implemented. And there is where I think the relationship with the auto industry has been built over decades. I think it's a reasonable, respectful relationship, except when we find massive violations like we did in the Volkswagen case, which is, in some ways created a revolution of its own in the way the company dealt with the aftermath of that. But I think it shows that you can build a bureaucracy with people who are very deeply technically knowledgeable, and have the resources to craft regulations which will work.
So, Mary, when it comes to vehicles, and I'm sure I will ask this in an inartful way, but you commented about the dramatic improvements in the emissions of various pollutants from vehicles over the course of the last 20 or 30, 40 years. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people wouldn't necessarily know, just what a very small percentage it is today that a vehicle emits from what it would have been in 1971 or 1975 or whatever, and just the incredible improvements that have come about.
So there used to be a joke, actually, if you remember Click and Clack, the Tappet brothers on NPR, somebody wrote in and asked them the question, or called in and asked the question about committing suicide using your car and, locking the garage and turning the engine on. And they claimed, I wouldn't ask anybody to try this, believe me, that it would now be impossible to commit suicide because your car wouldn't emit enough CO2 to do the job.
Not only does David know Click and Clack, that was the analogy he used when we set up Energy Straight Talk, that we want to be like Click and Clack. So
I love those guys.
Well, so my question for you, Mary, was just in light of and really this is in the context of the successful market programs that you've built and administered both at EPA and in California. There's been a lot of talk about moving to EVs. And in fact, the president just recently unveiled a plan just in terms of moving to a lot of EVs, and some of the auto manufacturers have announced that as well. And yet the transition that will be required in order to bring that about, both in terms of vehicles as well as fueling infrastructure, is obviously massive. And I think there was an article in the Times, the New York Times the other day, that just noted 2014 Nissan sold 30,000 Leafs, and that's still an American record. but that, it talks about the fact that, that Ford sells 800,000 F-Series pickups every year. So, I mean, it's just there's the scale that will be required in order to change. I guess the question is, do you think that as a policy matter, when it comes to vehicles in the transportation sector, is it better to say, look, we need to go to EVs and we need these programs that will bring about EVs? Or would it be, look, I mean, we want to go about as a market, we'll go out, take a market approach in terms of emissions reductions from the transportation sector. And here's what the mandate is or the goal is. And look, companies, you go figure out how that is going to have to work. But we're not going to tell you whether it's EVs or internal combustion engines or how it is that's or fuel or renewable fuel or whatever that's going to be. I mean, just what do you think about that overall?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think the horse has already left the barn on that one, to use a really old-fashioned analogy. But, when President Biden gave his State of the Union address last night, I mean, he cast it in terms of winning the 21st century, and he talked about China. China not only has, I don't know, 50 or 60 different companies that are manufacturing electric vehicles, but they have policies in place in their largest cities where, in a very short amount of time, you won't be able to register any vehicle that isn't an electric vehicle at all. So important as the US market is, it is no longer what's driving decision-making on the part of the auto industry, which is a global industry. And they are going to have to be at the forefront of making and selling attractive, affordable electric vehicles in order to survive. And I think it's that rather than the conversion to, being believers in global warming that's driving most of these big changes. Ford has already announced an electric version of the F-150, which is their biggest seller of pickup trucks. It's an iconic vehicle. And now they're suffering from concern about whether there's going to be enough batteries for those vehicles. The plant that's supposed to build the F-150s is having issues about this, and they're going to have to, what they're doing is they're investing in battery production. They're going to be owning and building their own batteries. Is that the right solution, or would it be better to have, lots of different choices of where to go, which kinds of vehicles? I think we're going to end up having for a long time to come, even if all of the emphasis is on the battery electrics. I foresee that for decades to come, we're going to be needing cleaner liquid fuels for the legacy fleet of ICE engines, diesel engines, and internal combustion engines. And I also believe that there's going to be a role for hydrogen as a transportation fuel, not just in big ships, but for locomotives and for big over-the-road trucks. So we're not coming to the point where everything is going to come with a plug.
On this, and you touched upon the whole battery issue. I mean, one aspect of that, of course, is where those raw materials come from. I mean, in terms of primarily China, Africa. I mean, where they have to come from. I mean, this is something that I don't think is. I mean, I don't know. Is that something we ought to be? Should we be thinking about that? I mean, in terms of if we should, how should that factor into any of our decision making about this?
Well, first of all, I think it's healthy that we are looking down the road to a situation where we're going to be seriously constrained by supply chain issues, not just the human rights aspects of materials that come from places where they're mined with child labor or with horrible environmental practices, but also that we're concerned about the possibility if we're totally dependent on one country that is not necessarily a close ally of ours, to supply it, and the ability of them to, anybody to cut us off, and thereby engage in a form of warfare through, products, through chemicals and minerals. So people are starting to ask all of the right questions about where the supplies are going to come from. And I guess that's part of what gives people some optimism as well, because when we look at, for example, the raw materials um, for battery construction, they happen to be available in mines and places that were mined for other minerals before anybody cared about, the minerals that we need for making batteries. And we're looking at places like the desert of the Imperial Valley in California, the area around the Salton Sea, deserts in Nevada, and abandoned mines in various places in the West. Maybe others too, but the ones I happen to know about are in Western states, where there's minerals that just there wasn't a market for, and now there could be a market for them. This is a good thing. Mining is not a pretty business. It does create waste and can destroy landscapes, but particularly where you got places that where there's mining that's already occurred, and you can go back and extract materials. This is a good thing in and of itself.
Mary, I just want to ask a general question. You spent your whole professional career working on air pollution, and most recently for a long time on climate improvement. What worries you the most? If you think of how, we're going to get from where we are now to 2050 and where we need to get given the urgency of the problem. We've talked about promising technologies, promising regulatory approaches. What worries you the most in terms of our ability to screw this up?
That's a great question. Um, you know, I don't. I guess I should just say I'm pretty much of an optimist, not just because I'm a believer in technology, although I do believe in humans' ability to invent their way out of a lot of problems.
The vaccine?
For example, the vaccine, exactly. And then afterwards we say, oh yeah, it was no big deal, but really it was a very big deal. And that's true of all of the kinds of inventions that we're talking about right now. And people make money doing it. So that's also a feature of our society as well. But I do worry that there's not enough time to solve these problems, and that some of the less talked about effects of the amount of greenhouse gases that we already have in the atmosphere are going to make life, not just in the United States, but in many other parts of the world, much less livable than it is today, and that opportunities will be destroyed. At one point, 10 years ago, people were talking about island nations in the Pacific that were going to lose their home because their land would be completely underwater. And a lot of people from some of those smaller nations have already been moved. I mean, they're not able to be there anymore. The floods and the fires and the devastation are enormous. And, we read about them in the New York Times or see them on television, and, we're horrified for a while, but then, we go on to other things. This is one more of those stressors which can make life even worse for poor and vulnerable people in vulnerable communities, and again, enrich others, right, who not only are the ones who are investing in some of the new technologies, but can afford to move. And of course, there are a few side effects, I guess, of global warming, which people can even see as benefits in certain areas of the globe where, some rising temperatures or some more rainfall isn't necessarily a bad thing. but overall loss of coastlines and of the communities that are dependent on those coastlines, the potential for just whole populations of people to be affected, it remains enormous, and we don't have a lot of time, and it still seems as though we're acting as though we can operate in the same way that we have in the past, which is let's do the easy things first and postpone the hard ones, the hard political choices until later. And I think that's probably to sort of get to the bottom line here, the failure to make some of those hard choices and to really seriously look at some of those devastating impacts is the thing that worries me the most.
I agree with you on all of that. And definitely people reading the newspaper and thinking, oh, that's terrible about Alaskan villagers that are being relocated. But candidly, when you start seeing wildfires in California and polar vortexes in Texas and all, it feels closer to home for many people than it did a couple of years ago, I think. David, and then why don't you ask one more, then I'll ask the closing question.
Yeah,
Sorry,
no,
we didn't get to all of them.
yeah, thanks, Cheryl. Yeah, there are lots of good questions in the chat, Marion. Unfortunately, and of course, Cheryl and I had long lists of questions to ask, which we've asked of you. But there are a couple of questions in the chat about this carbon dividends proposal. That I mean, there's been a bill introduced in Congress. I mean, some have been out there talking about that for a while. I mean, what's your thought about that?
The idea that
What is it? Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm not,
book,
I understand the details of how that's intended to work. So maybe
yeah,
you.
but, I mean, just essentially that I think the overall concept is there would be really a per ton price put on carbon that would result in certain amounts of revenue, and then that it would be put into a trust fund, and then or a vehicle of some kind, and then it would be dividended back to Americans through, I mean, either on a pro rata basis or some basis like that. But that's just the general concept, with very strict limits on what the administrative fees would be, and also they would be put into this trust fund, so it doesn't just create a pot of money that could be appropriated by Congress for whatever they felt like appropriating it for. It would all go straight back in dividends.
So it's one variant on a cap and trade type program, but instead of allowing for the well, there are different ways you can deal with whatever revenue is generated, whatever comes to the government. I don't have a strong view on that, mainly because I'm really at the point of saying I'm in favor of anything that can pass. And I think that the side effects or the potential downsides of any of these can be addressed. It can be fixed over time. The carbon tax approach, or the fee, has the problem that you have to set the price right, and you don't know what it really ought to be to achieve the results that you're trying to achieve. So the benefit of a cap is, it just has a limited number of allowances or credits, or however you set it up, and then you can reduce it readily. A tax or fee scheme means that you have to constantly adjust it if it's going to have any impact, unless it's too great, in which case it could shut down the economy. But I'm assuming that's not going to, that nothing like that would pass. So then it just becomes a way of raising money to put in a trust fund, which could be a good thing to do, but it may not get you the results. This is why I've been convinced that we need a mix of measures, including a pricing measure, but blended with mandates for zero emission or zero carbon electricity, changes in the infrastructure to make it support zero emission vehicles, and that we have to kind of weave that thinking into everything that we're doing. We can't just pass one bill and expect it to do the job.
Well, this has been a wonderful conversation, and I'm really sorry we didn't get to all the questions. Some of them were very specific questions about California from people who obviously have followed your programs very closely. I do want to close on a more general question about California that I think is dear to your heart is that how California is perceived in other parts of the country. My friend Travis Kavula, a former commissioner in Montana, calls it Caliphobia. Why the other Western states who would gain so much from being in a trading regime, some kind of market with California, are afraid of of being, held under California's policies. But even in other parts of the country, I've been in meetings here in Boston where people say, if we don't do this, we'll end up like California. We could be like California, as if it's, the thing to be afraid of. And I want to give you a chance to address that because I know it's something you feel strongly about. Um,
Sure. Well, I'm an adopted Californian. I was born in Minnesota and raised in Ithaca, New York. So I didn't come to California until after I graduated from law school, actually. And I am passionate about it. And my kids are native Californian, so I'm almost a native at this point. Um, I once heard Jerry Brown, and I think he said similar things to this, but it's a sort of a typical Jerry Brownish statement talking about why California was a good place to try out ideas about how to address global warming. He was talking to a group of visitors. In this case, I think they were actually all from India. And he said, everybody in the world wants to be like California because we're big and we're rich and we're beautiful. And I thought, okay, that tells it like it is. But it's also true that people in other places aren't necessarily always eager to hear from us about how great we are and how we invented everything first in California. And that's obviously not true. But it is true that the state is very big. So it's an economy of its own that's big enough for people to pay attention to. And it has been home over the years to innovation, some of which is not good. Charles Manson was from California. I mean, I'm sure there are many other examples that we can give of really bad or nutty things that have emanated from California as well. But I think it is that influence that ideas coming out of California have had that probably is the hallmark of the state. And at least in my time as a Californian, what I have seen is a lot of resilience. We've been through, extremes, and when there's a recession nationally, it usually is deeper in California, but then the rebound is also bigger in California. And we are willing to experiment and try things and take the risk that something that we do won't be perfect and will have to be changed or fixed. And there is that seeming confidence in the system, which in turn I would attribute in very large part to the fact that it's a state of immigrants, that it historically has attracted people from around the world. The fact that we have a very strong and ongoing dialogue with China, even while recognizing that the United States and China have many things to be, to fear or to oppose. But the fact that the sons and daughters of the Chinese elite are educated frequently in our universities in California, even despite the fact that we had horrible anti-Chinese laws on the books, for many years. But nowadays it's seen as a place where we kind of get what China is thinking about, and the Chinese experts are willing to spend time with us, in an institute that I have been involved with at Berkeley, sharing ideas about policies that could work to address global warming. I just think it's that kind of expansive thinking, which is tied in large part to the fact that we've attracted some of the best and the brightest, as well as the poor and people in need, but those who had the energy to come and to be a part of our society, I think has made the state very special. And so I understand that you can't win friends easily in Montana by telling them that an idea came from California, but I think what we do have is what we have is a system where overall basis we're able to play our role in the region anyway, even if people may not always want to hear that it was a California idea.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you came from California to join us at Columbia. So far, just metaphysically, but perhaps in person at some point. And I'll let David close it out. Thanks very much, Mary.
Thank you.
And am I supposed to close it out?
You were going to close it out, Cheryl, but I'm
I
happy to
have
close
it
it
written
out.
right here in my own typing. I do want to thank Mary and David and everyone who's been a part of today's program. And I wanted to tease our next program, which will be on Monday, June 28th. So just about 2 months from today at 4 p.m. David and I will host Gil Quinones, the CEO of the New York Power Authority, and Steve Wright, who's the general manager of the Chelan Public Power District and the former CEO of Bonneville Power Administration. And we're going to be talking about the role of public power in the energy transition, something that doesn't get as much press as I think it's actually contributing, as well as the controversial but high potential role of hydropower in our climate transition at that event. So I hope you can join us. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.